welcome to our Career Conversations panel about discovering green careers. My name is Liz Cook and I'm the Employer and Alumni Liaison at the Career Center. Right next to me we have Dr. Ann Bell, and she's Director of Conservation and Education at Ontario Nature. And she's an alumna. She's an NES and PhD Environmental Studies. And next to her we have Dr. Sheila Colla, and she is an assistant professor here at York University, and she's also an alumna with a PhD in biology. And next to her we have Alexandra McDonough, and she is an alumna with an MES in planning. And next to Alexandra we have Kate Hayes, who's manager of Aquatic and Wetland Ecosystem Restoration with Credit Valley Conservation. And she's also an alumna with an MES in Integrated Watershed Management. And next to Alexandra, we have Susanne Poltrok, and she's Director of Environmental Affairs with Morguard Investments, and she's an alumna with BS in Environmental Policy and Practices. And on the very end of the panel, we have Brady Romanson, and he is a project manager, research analyst with DPRA Canada. So welcome, thank you very much for being here.
So as mentioned, I work for a conservation organization, a charitable group called Ontario Nature. And our mission is protect wild species and wild spaces across the province. And my role at Ontario Nature is to oversee all of the programs, which basically means all of our conservation work, our policy work, and our education and outreach work. That's the kind of thing that I look after. It involves a lot of sort of management and planning of projects and fundraising, lots of efforts to try to bring money in the door for projects, as well as evaluation and a fair bit of media, social media, and in more conventional media is part of that job as well.
Sheila Colla, I'm assistant professor here in the Faculty of Environmental Studies. I'm teaching, maybe some of you, resource management at the undergraduate and graduate level. I also have a research program that deals primarily with at-risk pollinator species and at-risk species in general. And working on species that are declining in Canada, figuring out by how much they're in decline, what might be threatening their populations, and working with NGOs and governments to figure out how we can help them.
I'm Alex. I'm a planner at the Canadian Urban Institute. So it's a nonprofit organization that's just celebrated our 25th anniversary this year. We primarily were 95% funded through project work. So we do a lot of education and outreach, which gives us our charitable status, but we do lots of consulting work for municipalities mostly and for different levels of government. So as a planner, I guess my main role is to really convene different groups of people to solve complex problems. So we convene people, we take notes, we try to distill everything we've learned from talking to people and from the research we've done and from policy analysis, and then distill all that, communicate it to decision makers so that they can make evidence-based decisions really with it. So I'm a planner, I'm also a project manager. That's a little bit of a different role. Sometimes I'm just a project manager on things, other times I'm a planner and a project manager on a project. So that's really more about making sure things are on time and on schedule and on budget, and that things are delivered at a quality that everyone's happy with.
I'm Kate Hayes. I'm the manager of Aquatic and Wetland Restoration with Credit Valley Conservation. The conservation authorities were founded in the 1950s. We manage on a watershed basis. So CVC covers all of Credit River, as well as 14 other, we call them orphan streams. They drain directly into Lake Ontario. My role there is overseeing. My group is involved in all the restoration related to river, shoreline restoration, and wetland restoration projects throughout our jurisdiction. So it's pretty varied. It's a combination of taking the theory of science and applying it in projects that could be anything from working with an individual farmer to corporations to different types of agencies, municipalities, and other government agencies. So it's pretty varied.
Hi, I'm Susanne Poltrok. I'm the Director of Environmental Affairs for a company called Morguard Investments Limited. Morguard is a commercial real estate investment company. The Morguard Investments Limited is a part of a larger corporation that holds its own assets. We also buy and sell on behalf of pension fund clients and private investors. So my role, I guess, is to run all of the environmental issues that come out of owning real estate. We own all kinds of different assets, hotels, commercial, residential. So what do we do? Well, I'm on the due diligence team for acquisitions of, so I'm looking for any potential liabilities from environmental matters at our properties, and then trying to frame them into a purchase and sale agreement to ensure that our clients are protected. So I'm responsible for ensuring that all of our properties in Canada and the US are in compliance with all environmental regulations. I work on environmental law. I'm involved in all the development work that goes on when we're building buildings, leasing, contract negotiation. My group manages all the asbestos abatement at all of our properties, mold abatement. We have many soil and groundwater remediations that we're looking after at our properties from some tenant uses that are going on. I conduct training for all of our operations staff in Canada and the US. We developed our own environmental management system for our company. We look at indoor air quality as well in our buildings.
My name is Brady Romanson, and I work with DPRA Canada. It's a consulting firm here in Toronto. We take on a variety of different projects, both with the public and private sector. So we do change management and organizational reviews. Then what I primarily work in is socioeconomic impact assessment. I do that primarily with the resource extraction sector, nuclear management, other energy sectors. And so we would go in an environmental assessment scenario. We would be there to do the socioeconomic impact assessments for that project. We also do a lot of the consultation work associated with that, so community consultation, getting out there and making sure people are understanding what the project is all about. And we also run the Aboriginal engagement with a lot of those projects. So the projects I've been involved with primarily take place in Northern Ontario or in the Arctic, Canada's territories, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. And so that's sort of the realm I work in. I am a planner, and so I do work in sort of that consultation engagement realm as a planner, doing a lot of the primary field data collection, interviews, field surveys, that sort of thing, and then taking that back and writing up the reports that go along with our projects.
I used to be a French teacher. I was a French teacher in Parry Sound at the high school for 5 years. And I'm a total artsy background, language, literature, philosophy. That's what I studied in my undergrad and in the graduate degree as well. But I became more and more interested in environment when I was teaching, and I decided I wanted to look into it. And I was so lucky to find FES because it's one of those places where I didn't need to be a scientist to get into environmental studies. And so that was my ticket. So I did my MES here, and then I did a PhD because I felt after I'd done my MES, I was just getting started in this whole new field. So I went on and did a PhD, and when I graduated from there, and that was in 2000, I started having kids. So I worked at home, and I did a lot of consulting work, and I did as well a fair bit of volunteer work, and eventually I was quite happy doing that, working at home and working as a consultant. And but then this job offer kind of fell on my plate to work for Ontario Nature, which is an organization that I'd done a lot of work for, both on contract and as a volunteer. And it was perfect for me because it combined a long-standing interest in education with my interest in wildlife and wildlife conservation especially. So that's kind of my career. So I've been there now for 8 years, and it's been a fantastic experience. And one of the really wonderful things about it is that my whole background in French and English and philosophy and all the rest is so useful in the environmental, in the field of conservation. Meaning to be able to communicate verbally and in writing, and to be able to analyze arguments and tear apart policy. That's so you know, you never know where you're going to come from and where you're going to end up. But when I left high school, I didn't even know my career existed. So you never know where your path will lead.
I grew up in the city, and I thought bees were, you know, something to run away from or squish. So if you told my high school self that I would be a bee scientist, I would have, you know, thought you were just crazy. But I went to the University of Toronto in human biology, really thinking I would be a doctor, not a doctor of bees, but a medical doctor, and realized pretty quickly that everyone at the University of Toronto in human biology wanted to be a doctor, and so I had to think of something else. So I went into ecology and evolution, and part of my degree there incorporated research experience as for coursework, which I guess we have here at FES as well. So I was placed randomly into a lab that worked on bees, and I had to do basically psychology experiments in cages, standing there with bees flying around me. So I had to get over of this fear that I had, you know, for 20 years of bees pretty quickly to be able to do my work. And then I realized that actually I had nothing to be afraid of because they did not care about me, and I could get really close to them. So after working in that lab for 3 years in my undergrad, I did an honors thesis in that time looking at sort of a conservation project with the bees, with bumblebees. So at that time I decided to do a PhD, and I came here to York, and I talked to Lawrence, and I said, you know, no one is working on the conservation of bumblebees in Canada right now. So would you be interested in taking me on to do that project? And that was before colony collapse disorder. It was literally 1 year before colony collapse disorder hit. And then all of a sudden, the decline of bees became this well-known topic. So I got lucky in that I chose a topic that then became, you know, very important. But I really just sort of took one step at a time. I was like, okay, I like doing this, I'll do that. But I didn't actually know from point A how to get to point B. And then, so because bees became such a important topic among, like, in the public and in policy, in addition to the scientific research I was doing for my PhD work, I became very involved with Environment Canada, the Ministry of Natural Resources, working on helping them with policy, writing status reports for policy, working with the public, trying to get them to realize, you know, this is the situation with bees. And actually my history of being scared of bees put me in a really great position to be able to talk to people about why they shouldn't be scared of bees, because I knew exactly where they were coming from. So that was really helpful. And yeah, I started working with NGOs and sort of, I guess, expanded my research program from there. So when I finished my PhD in 2012, I took on a postdoctoral fellowship with a not-for-profit organization because I was interested in taking the science and putting it to on-the-ground management. So that was an industrial fellowship that no longer exists through NSERC. And then after that, I got another fellowship, which is called the Librero Fellowship, which if any of you go into interdisciplinary conservation science, that's a really great one to look into. So that fellowship, in addition to having this amazing network of career biologists at early stages of their career, exposed me to policy training, communications training, media training, and all sorts of things about co-management, and sort of the social science aspects of the work that I've been sort of working towards. So that, you know, helped prepare me for my position here at York at an interdisciplinary faculty. So I just started here at York this past July.
Similarly, my path has not been linear. I did my undergrad at McGill in cultural studies, which is essentially an English degree. And I thought about teaching maybe, so I lived in Japan for 2 years teaching. Realized that wasn't for me. Came back to Canada, and well, after I spent another couple years traveling, came back to Canada, dabbled in sort of the arts and entertainment world. That didn't really do it. I tried some research work, and I was still not really that challenged or interested in the work I was doing. So I decided to just change gears, and I thought that the best way to do that would be to go back to school and kind of not start from scratch, but be able to change trajectory a little bit. And FES was really the perfect place for me to do that, because it was the place that allowed me to combine my interest in culture and the arts with cities. And the time I spent traveling really inspired me and had me thinking about cities and how cities around the world behave differently and are shaped completely by culture. So at FES, I focused on cultural planning, and I graduated in 2009. At that point, cultural planning wasn't really on very many people's radars, but here I was able to kind of fashion my own program, take classes and courses in other parts of the university that really supported my research. And actually, my advisor here put me in touch with my current supervisor. So he did some talk maybe similar to this at York when I was here, and then I approached him after and sent in my research, had a meeting with him, and I started at CUI as an intern, and eventually that led to a contract position and then eventually a full-time position, and I've been there for 6 years now.
I remember vividly actually being I was an undergraduate in biology, and one of my profs said to me, because I had no idea what I was going to do, and he said, there are too many scientists with no policy background, too many policymakers with no science background. So he said you need to get more of an understanding of the policies behind the science. So I took that and took off to East Africa for, 7 or 8 months, and wandered around there. And then when I got back, I ended up at FES, and I did my MES in Integrated Watershed Management. And that allowed me to kind of consider science in the context of policy. And from there, I graduated with all sorts of great ideas what I was going to do. And it was deep in a recession, and jobs were not forthcoming. So I ended up in the US in consulting, stayed there for a bit. And then when I finally came back here, it was still pretty bad. So I worked for everything from Ducks Unlimited to all sorts of different organizations for several years, actually, until finally landing my first real job, which was with Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. I worked for them in a range of jobs, from reviewing development applications to aquatic biology. Then I went on secondment to the federal government I have attention deficit disorder, as you can tell. I went to work with their species at risk group for about 4 years, and then I decided I wasn't accomplishing anything there, so I just quit, and I quit with nothing to go to. At that time, I was offered a job with Nature Conservancy or a small consulting company, and I went with the consulting company because it was an opportunity to advance work in private-public sector partnerships, which I thought would be really interesting. So I worked with them for a few years all on species at risk recovery implementation programs, but working a lot with corporations. So that was really interesting to me, but I didn't want to get into mainstream consulting. So when they started pushing me to do that, I did what I always do, and I quit. And I went to Credit Valley Conservation, and I have actually stabilized. I've been there for about 5 years. I love it. I only work on implementation projects, but it's definitely been quite a route to get there.
I had no idea what I wanted to take. I was in university at 18 and was in several majors in my undergrad in my first year. All I wanted to do was graduate and get a job, and I was terrified at some of the kinds of programs that were very general. So after hopping around a while, I ended up in the environmental studies program, and chose the path of business in the environment. Any courses that led to business, environmental economics, auditing courses, anything that I thought I could apply. I find, I guess my opinion is, in some cases, degrees don't have a practical component to them. And so how do you market yourself when you're finished your degree? So during university, I worked everywhere. I volunteered and worked at the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Natural Resources. I worked for the Toronto Conservation Authorities. I worked for the City of Mississauga Waste Management Recycling Division. I did anything that I could get my hands on to build my resume. I did electrofishing on Lake Ontario to tag and weigh and fish and all the different species there. I even spent many days tracking wild turkeys for the reintroduction program with the Ministry of Natural Resources. And the only reason I was telling these guys, the only reason I bring that up is because when I finished university, I worked temporarily for a green, I can't even remember the name of the company. It was a very short term, but it was trying to find companies to work with green procurement, which back then, that didn't even exist. Now it's, I think, in every company's model, but there was a job in the Toronto Star back in the day when jobs were in newspapers, and it was for an environmental assistant for the company that I work for now. And there were 750 applicants for the position. I went through 4 interviews and had to write an engineering test, and I am not an engineer. But I bring up my volunteer and work experience during my university days because what interested the person to get me an interview was tracking wild turkeys. And, you know, they thought, what is that? And I got to meet this person. So, and then, you know, after that, I did well in school. I was interested in it, but it wasn't like I had a passion for it, to be honest. The passion developed over the years working in what I'm doing now. And, you know, I find it really interesting that one of the paths in the bachelor's program when I started was sustainability. And I thought, this is a bunch of a crock. I couldn't believe there would even be a path towards sustainability. I thought, who's going to buy into that? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it was the whole thing. And now, I mean, my company, we have a whole sustainability group, and I'm on their committee. It's interesting how things kind of develop. It was very European at the time, and a lot of the case study work was only in Stockholm and Sweden. And but, you know, we actually implement it. We have a great sustainability program at work. But I do just want to stress to you guys that everything you do, it matters, and it'll help you. You know, it might open a door for you or get you an interview like it did for me.
I'm a recent graduate. I graduated in 2011 from MES. And the first thing I realized when I was in the workforce is I'm no longer, you know, evaluated by the grade I got on my paper or the GPA I have. It's about the experiences you have that you grow on your resume. And so that's when I really realized that if there's 700 applicants, they all had the same master's degree I did, but what sets me apart? So just a small side. To the question, my career story, I started at Carleton University. I did a physical geography degree. This is around the time the climate change discussion really was coming out, and really the first time I was exposed to it. And so everything was about climate change, and how, as a physical geographer, you learn about the Earth's systems and how humans are impacting those systems. So I was very heavy throughout my undergrad. And that brought me to pursue the master's program here at York University to do planning. And so if humans are affecting the Earth, I thought, well, why not learn about the humans and how we can plan for interacting back with the Earth the other way. So that's sort of how my interest morphed into coming to MES. While I was here, I did the planning certificate, and then I followed on after the year or two work experience to do the planning exam, and so accredited planning after that. So that's sort of the path I took through school. When I was at school, I took a chance on an opportunity. There was a job application for, well, it was more of an internship at a research I don't even know what you would call it. It was just like one of the professors emeritus here ran something called the Silver Hill Institute, and so I applied, and I was researching a whole bunch of weird stuff, but it was fun and it was interesting and it got me doing something different. That opportunity put me into the office I'm currently in because that professor also worked for the same consulting company where I am. And so by sitting in that office, by taking that chance on that opportunity for an internship, I was exposed to the consulting world and the work they did. And it was just one of those days where they were swamped. They had so much to do and so few hands that something came across my desk and they said, we need you to do this. And so that's just how I got myself into. And after about 8 months interning, I was hired on and have been there for about 5 years.
My volunteer work was definitely environmental related because I still didn't really, one of the reasons I agreed to come today is because I didn't even know that environmental pertained to real estate. When I was in school, it wasn't an area of study that I had chosen, and it didn't come up in any of the models. So I really didn't know what I was going to do, and so government was one of the easiest ways to get in and get some experience. But I also worked I had other jobs as well. I worked for other businesses in the summertime, or like I worked at Food City that doesn't even exist, Metro or whatever they call it now. Like, you know what I mean? I did have some business experience from summer work that had nothing to do with the environment, and then had supplemented that with volunteer work from the environmental area.
Right from the start in the MES program, one of the things I love about that whole program is the way you can incorporate experience into your degree. So you can go out and do job, I forget what you call it, field experience or whatever, and incorporate that. So I did, and I volunteered for several different environmental organizations, one of which is my current employer.
Yeah, for sure. Right now, like if you get on it this week, there's the NSERC Undergrad Research Award. So that was how I got started in research, because it pays for you to work in a research lab for 4 months in the summertime, which, if you need to work during the summertime, is perfect. And once you get your first NSERC award, I'm told it's easier to get scholarships going forward, and I did end up getting full scholarships for my PhD and postdocs as well. So I think trying to get those early, smaller grants early on really help, particularly if you don't have money to fund yourself, like to be in school for 30 years or however long it takes. So that even the small, like getting into some of the societies, like for me, the Entomological Society of Ontario, I mean, these are people who are just really interested, and they really help motivate you when you're trying to study for your exams. You go out and you just see these people who are just interested in learning about the science for fun. And that sort of rejuvenates yourself when you're feeling a little bit down about, some of the more tedious parts about being in science. And then again, like I tried to take as many opportunities, and during my degree, specifically for me for my undergrad, to try to get coursework to incorporate grabbing experience elsewhere. So I did, that second year placement course, and then I did an honors thesis in my third year and an honors thesis in my fourth year. And that gave me research experience to go directly into my PhD without a master's. Yeah, and every summer I tried to get some sort of related field work job.
My experience is much more kind of, I'll use the term applied. So I certainly don't do much work other than sending things off to labs. I don't do much work as far as labs are concerned. All the work we do is actually in the field. We do sometimes partner with universities for various studies, but it's usually to answer very specific questions that we have about why a restoration technique is or is not working. I was just thinking, she mentioned that she was from Washington State University, and it reminded me that I've got a friend of mine who is teaching there, and just to give you an example, his undergraduate was in English. He's now, every time I speak to him, he's off in Alaska studying river processes, so he definitely went from that arts background to very, very definite science. So I think it is possible. There's a lot of associations, field groups, the field botanists, there's the Toronto Entomologists Associations. That's where you're actually meeting people who are working in the field, like Sheila and others.
And they run like workshops over the weekends for
Yeah,
plant
I think-
identifications and things like that too.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So that's a really, really good way. And it's also just a good way, if you're not really sure, to sort of test the waters by just getting out there and literally working side by side with some really, really leading edge scientists. And they're there because they love it and it's their passion. But it'll give you a sense, even going on a botanist, what is it, the Ontario, I've forgotten, the field botanists of Ontario, but you spend the day with them and it'll give you a sense whether that interests you without actually committing to another degree. Because I know in the case of Jim, my friend at Washington State, he literally has 4 degrees. He has 2 masters, an undergrad and a PhD. So he had a fairly colorful route too.
Really, what I did is, as you may know, there's a plan of study. So you come in and that first course you take, you design sort of how you want to progress through your 2 years, 24 months in the program. And I knew I wanted to be planning, so I checked a box that said, please mark me as a planner, and it was as simple as that. And then I was in the planning stream. Past that, you then had to do the required planning courses. And I was able to do those all within the first year. So I didn't really do any electives, I just did all the planning courses that interest me. I did more or less the environmental planning side and environmental assessment side, and then got all the planning requirements. So then I was essentially ready to graduate with the planning certificate. So that's what you need to do. I would say understand, perhaps do a little background research for yourself on what type of planner you think you might want to be, what type of organization you might want to work in, because you can be a planner who does something very specific to a planner who does very much a generalist and can do a lot of different things.
Program at York is very flexible and kind of open, so you really have to make it what you want it to be. So the more knowledge you have about planning and kind of where you think you fit within the planning spectrum, the better, because kind of like, in your first week you'll be expected to put together this plan of study where you're outlining the next 2 years. And I remember thinking that a lot of the people in the program knew exactly what they wanted to study and like exactly where they wanted to be, and I didn't feel that way. I felt pretty overwhelmed at first because I was just kind of figuring it out. So the more prepared you are for like where you want to be, because you also have to start thinking about your field experience and your practical placements and things like that. And the earlier you can kind of plan for what you imagine those to be, the better. In my position, it's not that I'm making the decisions or that we're making the decisions necessarily. It's that we are gathering evidence, so some of it is data. A lot of it is anecdotal when we're going out and talking to people that are living certain experiences or having challenges or have expertise in certain area. And so we're gathering all that information, data and anecdotal, and kind of pulling it all together and then communicating it to the decision makers. So in a lot of the work that I do, it's government, or elected officials. So if we're doing it for a municipality, we're presenting to staff, bureaucracy, and to council as well what we've learned and what we've gathered. And it's based on data as much as we can make it be, but also on what people are saying and what people feel and what people think about things.
You can get 2 pictures painted based on the research you undertake. So if you're doing a lot of secondary source research from Stats Canada on how many people live in this certain location, or what sort of facilities or infrastructure they might have, you have sort of one picture. But until you go into the community and you talk with people and you understand that the seniors meet at the A&W every morning at 8 and they discuss a whole variety of topics about the town, and they're very plugged in, or there's the main employer is X, and you read that and but until you get there you understand the struggles that they're having on power hookups, water sanitization, waste, all that stuff that you can't really get on paper. You go and understand, so then you get this better picture of the community or the place or whatever it is that you're going to be writing about, making a decision on, to understand sort of what the implications are for whatever the project questions might be. So it very much helps you ground the background research that's secondary with a little bit of the primary data collection, and then you can make a better judgment or a more informed judgment or recommendation after you've done so.
Sometimes people want to make a decision, and then like whatever evidence is presented is more of a formality, and then they'll just make their decision, and they'll be like, yeah, we considered evidence. Like,
Story of our lives.
I guess it depends what level we're talking about. Typically, we would pull together our research and have findings and recommendations that we would present to city staff, say, who would then take that to council, where they ultimately make a decision. So we'd like to think that data matters and evidence matters, and I think increasingly it actually does. Like, there's an expectation out there now in the world that people make decisions based on the reality and the state of things rather than just a whim or a preference.
I want to talk just about the people that we've hired. We hire lots of young people all the time, usually for 1 year long contracts. Sometimes it goes longer than that. And we look for experience, definitely. It depends if it's entry level or not. We look for experience, relevant education. We've hired people right with a BA. Actually, I think hers was a B. Maybe it was a BSc, but anyway, it was an environmental bachelor's degree, and she's been with us. This woman I'm thinking of has been with us for 5 or 6 years now. I mean, so sometimes we hire straight with a B.Ed. Sometimes we require graduate degrees. It does depend on the job, but I would say volunteer experience really does count. And for this woman in particular, we were hiring for an education position. The fact that she had consistently been working with youth as a camp counselor was huge in our decision to hire her, because we knew that she could do the work that she would be required to do. She had that kind of experience. So it was summer jobs and it was volunteer that landed her that job. Someone had been talking about the science piece. One of the lovely things now too with the science piece is there are all kinds of citizen science opportunities out there, all kinds of citizen science projects that one can volunteer for and get really good experience, and not only that, but connect with professionals in the field. And for me, landing my job at Ontario Nature was partly about volunteering, but also because I knew through my volunteer work, I actually knew the woman who was hiring me, and I'd known her for 20 years. But that was just because I'd volunteered so many years earlier. So volunteering gets you more than experience, it also gets you important connections. And I also have people who volunteer for me who ask for references, which I can then give often to people that I know in the field. So those connections are quite important.
Well, definitely working with professors. I mean, I have a ton of projects and grad students and postdocs who would love, an extra set of hands. And we work, with partners, Nature's Conservancy, we work with Ontario Nature. So there's lots of opportunity just by learning who your profs are and what kind of research they do and who they work with, and they might be able to set you up with something.
Keep attending events like this. It's good to get out and, if there's a colloquium or whatever you want to do around the school, and it's good just to get out and you can just rub elbows with, other people in your student body, as well as, you can meet some panelists and get some ideas of what other people do. When I was a planner, for example, we had planning events through OPPI, and so students can go and pay a cheap fare, and you can get in and rub elbows with planners, and that's a great way just to get in the conversation really about what people are talking about, current events within the planning world that you may not be exposed to in school, but see what's out there. And I think that was good for me, just in terms of being able to start talking publicly and having that confidence about, here's someone who's 30 years experience in the planning world, and I'm joining that conversation. And so the more you do it, the better you get at it, and it becomes easier. And then, I think that'll really help you down the way.
There's a lot of really good groups on LinkedIn. You can meet a lot of people on LinkedIn. You can learn about also other functions. Like I belong to the brownfield redevelopment, environmental professionals, environmental consulting professionals, and a number of real estate groups. So they're constantly inviting people to attend things and networking events, and I'd highly encourage you to follow some of those on LinkedIn and, you know, make, I don't know, it's not Facebook, so don't friend them, but whatever it is, you know, like just try to put yourselves out there through those tools. They're excellent networking opportunities and job finding opportunities.
Fundamentally, I think it's putting a face to a name. It's, I mean, I'm not going to lie to you, it's incredibly competitive, and I benefit from that because honestly I have the best of the best of the best. But in the cases for people that I know who have kind of made a dent, it's almost always because they've started up with the volunteer route, and they come in, they're there, they're willing to do anything. And I had one last year who was working for chapters actually, and she really wanted to get into this field and couldn't get in the door. She worked for me whenever she could. She'd come in and she did everything from being out up to here in a wetland to filing to whatever. And then from there she there was a short 5-week contract, which because she'd worked for me, I could kind of put a word in for her. So she took that. Then long story short, she's now at Niagara College doing an ecosystem restoration diploma of sorts, but she's beyond happy. But she needed to kind of get that foot in the door. I would say I'm contacted several times a week by cold calls, people looking for jobs, and I'll always meet with somebody in terms of an informational meeting. I always make the time, but I can't, you know, I can't guarantee a job. What I can do is try to share that kind of and really encourage them to volunteer. The internships, all the associations that people, you know, I think one of the keys, and I brought this book because I think there is an equivalent for students, but this is a book that I would highly, highly, highly recommend. It's called Strengths Finder. And what it does basically is to, you do an online assessment that will tell you, and it's based on 20, 30 years of studies that will tell you what your areas of strengths are, what your leadership qualities are. And I'm actually using this. I've had all my staff complete this, and I'm using it to help position them best within my group. But I'm actually just putting my 15-year-old son through it to help him figure out what it is he wants to do. So I think it's as much about, and I think you touched on it as well, as kind of really figuring out for yourself what it is you want to do, and then you target where you want to be. I think the only qualifier I would put to that is go into it really looking for feedback from whoever it is, and not looking for a job. If that's your motivation, it's very obvious. And I think, you know, a lot of us are incredibly busy, and, you know, as I said, I'm more than happy to make the time if somebody is really just looking to better understand the field, to test the waters, to see if it's an area of interest for them. But it's a lot harder if they come in and they're desperate for a job.
When I was going through my PhD, I never actually thought I would go into academia, even though at all the job interviews I went to, they were like, oh, you should probably go into academia. But I tried to stay as applied as possible. So I don't know if that gave me an edge or not. But what I did do as a grad student was I was very involved with the Toronto chapter for Society for Conservation Biology, and that's actually where I met Kate, I think, for the first time. So there are scientific groups that try to apply their knowledge in different ways, and that's one here in Toronto. And now there's Evidence for Democracy, and they have, I think, a Toronto chapter, if not a couple people in Toronto working, and I know they're always looking for volunteers to help with their programs as well. So these are, you know, academic science students trying to bring the science out in different ways.
I think I was in undergrad. I don't really remember. It's all very vague at this point. But I actually volunteered to be part of a board, basically, that was called LEAP, and it was Legal Environmental Assistance Program, and that was connected with the Canadian Environmental Law Association. All that to say, I had no experience, but what I did get is exposure to lawyers, and at that point I was kind of playing around with environmental law. It was a really, really interesting experience. It, for me, secured the fact that I was not made out to be a lawyer, but it was a really great experience, and it was a good way to rule it out, actually.
In terms of hiring for my organization, for most of the environmental organizations I know, there's like I could be wrong, but I don't think PhD gives you that big an advantage for those kinds of jobs. I would say a master's degree definitely gives you an advantage. It gives you a big advantage. But PhD, it's not necessary. It's not needed. I have one, but it's not needed for my job, if you know what I mean. Through my volunteer work, I was well known in many organizations, and people could recommend me. So even as a consultant, I'd get recommendations from, you know, if somebody had a research project or a writing thing or an editing thing, they put my name forward to other people, so it helped a lot.
And I would say from my area, I would agree with Anne. I don't think a PhD is necessary. I do, from my group, it's we're very much in the field, so oftentimes it's people, a master's for sure is an asset, but I have a number of people with college degrees, but we're very in the field in doing the work. I do have other departments who are more, there are quite a lot of people with PhDs, but they're very much kind of very, very specific aspects of water quality or whatever. But I don't think for what I'm doing I think a master's is more than sufficient. When I was working with the federal government, there were a lot more people with PhDs, but again, a lot of them were research scientists. So again, I think it depends what your interests are and where you want to be, and then you figure out how to get there.
I would add that in the private consulting side, you work on new projects almost on a daily basis, weekly basis, or every few months there's a new project, and it's in all sorts of different areas. You draw from what you know in terms of your background and your experience from the projects you previously worked on and your education, but it's something new every day. And it's essentially because you write an RFP, a request for proposal, that submission goes in, and if you win, then that's the project you're going to work on, or what comes through the door, a little bit of a mismatch. So having a master's degree is sufficient, and then you build your experience in your resume just on the projects you work on, and you kind of snowball that through the career. So we're not sort of specialized in one specific area, but I would do socioeconomic assessment. I've worked on nuclear waste storage, gold mines. I've done program reviews in the Arctic on oil and gas exploration. And so the list goes on, and you just work in those areas and you build the experience on your resume. And I'm working in a company that's small but has 40 years experience doing what they do, and that's how I can bring myself in and gain those experiences in all those different areas. So you can be very much a generalist and good at a lot of things, and you don't necessarily need to be a master's of science on something specific in the private consulting world. In larger companies, there are a desk where that desk only does the one thing, and you could be that person. But it's really what you want to do with your career.
I feel like we're kind of bashing the PhD a little bit, not on purpose, but I personally took on doing a PhD because I was interested in a project and I knew it couldn't be done in 2 years. So I looked at it more as like a job to get this information collected and analyzed. And I think if you are doing a PhD, but you do want to go into more of an applied job, having those situations where you go to maybe the applied conferences instead of the pure academic ones, or joining these groups that do the applied work, I think you can still apply for these jobs where people with master's degrees would get them, and you'd still be competitive. So it's just shaping your PhD in a way that will keep you competitive in that sense, so that it looks like you're getting work experience in addition to developing your research.
When you finally do get to that first job of yours, you can walk in and you can assess the lay of the land and understand what the organization is all about. But once you're there and you're working in the field, I would say find your niche within that organization. So for myself, I write reports, but I'm not the best report writer in the office, and I know that, and I accept it. And so I can do that work, but I'm much better suited on my skill set to go to the field and to meet with people and to do that type of work. And so I can really shine for the company by going out into the field. And I know that. And there's people in my office who never want to go in the field, they just want to stay in the office. And that's, so I found a way to really grow myself within the company just by figuring out, okay, what am I good at? What does the company need? And can I find that sort of to do that type of work? And so once you get in and you do it a few times, then you can really start to project yourself in that way. So that's sort of the one thing I would say, just keep an eye out for when you're in an organization. What are their gaps and how can you fill it? I'd also just say that email is an interesting form of communication, but it's not a good form of communication. It's good for covering your butt in terms of a email paper string, but the best way to get things done is to pick up the phone and to have an in-person meeting. And so don't rely on email so much. Get out of your desk, walk down the hall, talk to people, and that's really the best way to learn. 30 seconds face-to-face, a couple minutes, that sort of thing inside the organization and even outside. You can send an email and it goes into the abyss and you wonder when it's going to come back, but always pick up the phone and it'll really help you out.
I encourage all of my staff, you need to speak to people to understand what their needs are, and email does not ever tell the full story. I find the younger generation is very reliant on technology, and I get it, but that face-to-face piece is so important. You will learn so much more in a 30-second conversation than you ever would over an email. My advice is, I know a lot of you have a specified area of study. Remain flexible. That is, I think that's only going to be a part of who you are in your career. It may end up being none of who you are in your career, or it may be everything. I think that, as Brady said, you need to go in and not pigeonhole yourself with your area of study. There are so many. Your area of study is going to get you in the door to whatever your job is going to be. And you're going to draw on all kinds of skills that you have from taking your master's or your undergrad or whatever it is, or your PhD. It's who you are and all the other things about you that are not just your degree that make you a great employee and are going to get you, face time with a good employer.
A degree is fantastic to have that, but it is a super competitive market. So you've got to do things to distinguish yourselves. Make sure take the time to tailor your resume. Do not send in generic ones because it's very irritating. I might look at 150 resumes for a 2-month position. So I'll go through and I'll rule out 130 of those in the first 10 minutes. And if they're not tailored, if the person hasn't taken the time to tailor their cover letter, I won't look at it. I guess know yourself, really, really think through. And, again, these types of tools, know yourself, know what it is you want to do. So I agree in terms of the flexibility. I think that's really important, but I think it's equally important to really know yourself so that you know what it is you want to do. There's no better motivator than passion for getting you where you want to be.
I think in terms of getting yourself a job, there's really no replacement for the face-to-face, and that's what everyone said. But if you've had a connection with someone, you meet them at an event, a networking event or a professional event, and then they follow up a little while later, and you maybe just remember their name, and that immediately just kind of brings them to the top of the list when you're looking for interns or volunteers or people for positions. So I think don't underestimate too that people, like you were talking about with the informational interviews, are actually very willing to take the time and sit down with students and people who are interested in talking about their careers. I think a lot of times you're afraid to reach out to people because you just think they're too busy or they won't make time, but I've really been struck by how willing most professionals are to take the time to talk to students. And I think also along that path, learning, having experiences, internships, volunteer experiences that teach you that that's not what you want to be doing are just as valuable as those ones that help you understand where you do want to be going. And then once you do get a job, like everyone said, the degree is important, but like once you get the job, you're starting from scratch essentially, and you're still kind of proving yourself every day and proving that you're a valuable asset to whoever you're working for. And a lot of times you'll start out on contract and your goal is to get a full-time job, so you've got to be kind of demonstrating that you're a valuable resource, and the way to do that is to really bring your unique skills and experience to the position. So, thinking outside the box a little bit, and that girl over there was talking about your interest in arts and culture, and if you can kind of bring your personal interests a little bit to the work that you do, you'll stand out, I think, and that'll help get you further ahead once you have the job that you want.
In addition to tailoring your resume in terms of getting a job, I think it's important not to sell yourself short as well. So if something does say, well, it really depends on the job, but in the case of the job that I have now, there was like 10 things listed and I fit into 2 of them, but I definitely didn't fit into all of them. But I had capacity to fit into the other one. So when you can't win the lottery if you don't buy a ticket, right? So it's important to not just throw out generic resumes all over the place, but also think about whether you would actually be able to do the job. And if you don't have the experience to do the job, show in your cover letter what makes you able to do the job. And then the other thing is not only censor your social media presence, but actually create a social media presence that will show who you are, because I don't know, maybe I'm probably not the only one here, but you do Google people's names when they come across your desk, and sometimes it's really interesting what pops up. But for me, I use Twitter in a professional manner, so I keep track of like what other people are doing in their research through Twitter. So there's a way to use social media to help you, advance in addition to possibly, have bad effects towards the job.
A couple of things. So we've talked a lot about the importance of experience and the relevance of education is one. Another thing that's become increasingly important in our organization when we hire are personal qualities. So understand, your own personal qualities as strengths, and think about the qualities that people want in their office or in their work environment. Those are the kind of qualities that you want to bring to the fore, whether it's passion or commitment or organization and so on. I think maybe because I'm a little bit older too, when I want to think about advice to people like you, I just want to say, and it's sort of it kind of jumps off of know yourself and follow your bliss. Like you have to know yourself, and you have to go where you really want to be in life, and just enjoy the journey as you go. I mean, it's just so important. And I think about the comment, that you have all these interests. Don't drop any of them. I mean, just follow them, and the doors will open. You don't know which way you'll go through. I think that's been a story right across the board here at the front, that if you keep open and you know the things that you like, stuff will come up. And so all the best.